The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers so grand they looked like they belonged in a palace. It was the kind of evening where champagne flowed like water, designer gowns swept across polished marble, and everyone spoke in hushed tones that made them feel more important. Among the swirl of satin, silk, and arrogance walked a woman who didn't quite match the room's performance. Her name was Amira. She arrived without a designer label. No flashing jewels, no red carpet presence. Her gown was simple, elegant, but without a brand tag anyone recognized. Her shoes were polished but not sky-high, and around her neck hung a necklace, delicate, understated, with a strange shimmer most people couldn't quite place. It wasn't loud, it wasn't glittering, but it caught the light in a way that felt ancient. She moved through the crowd with quiet grace, smiling kindly, speaking only when spoken to. And yet, within minutes, the whispers started. "Who invited her?" someone muttered behind a champagne flute. "Look at that necklace. Costume jewelry, I'm sure," another said, barely containing a smirk. "She must be someone's assistant or plus one." Amira heard every word, she always did, but she didn't flinch, didn't touch the necklace, didn't lower her eyes. A woman near the stage, cloaked in couture and layered in emeralds, leaned into a group and said loud enough for Amira to hear, "Honestly, if you can't wear something decent, why bother coming at all?" They laughed. Amira didn't. Because what none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that the necklace around her neck wasn't from a boutique or a pop-up brand. It was one of a kind, a private commission from a reclusive artisan, built with gems older than the room they were standing in, and worth more than every single accessory in that ballroom combined. But she didn't need to tell them that. Her husband would. Amira moved through the ballroom like a soft current, steady, composed, but always beneath notice. She was used to being overlooked in places like this. It was almost a tradition now. Elite event, elite crowd, and someone assuming she didn't belong. But tonight's mockery was especially sharp. Not because of what was said, but because of who said it. Across the room stood Celeste Montclair, heir to a luxury fashion house and self-declared tastemaker of the evening. With a following in the millions and an ego just as large, Celeste had a way of scanning people like product labels, checking for brand names, price tags, status cues. She'd noticed Amira from the moment she entered and had been whispering critiques to her entourage ever since. "You know," Celeste said, her voice honeyed and loud enough to travel, "I've seen that exact necklace at the flea market downtown. 3 for $10. Isn't that adorable?" Laughter bubbled around her like a well-rehearsed chorus. Amira stood quietly nearby, speaking to no one. She glanced once toward the stage, once toward the door, and then back to the crowd. Still smiling, still poised. A young woman beside Celeste chimed in. "It looks like she glued glass beads to a fishing wire." "I wouldn't even donate it," another added. "It would cheapen the thrift store." Amira's expression didn't change, but inside, she felt the quiet thud of memory. She had worn this necklace on her wedding day. It wasn't just expensive, it was sacred, forged with rare Paraíba tourmaline stones, mined decades ago, set in ethically sourced platinum, and infused with microscopic etching only visible under magnification. Her husband's initials and a quote from the poem he read the night they got engaged. And yeah, here it was, dismissed by strangers as cheap. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of a world that measured worth by flash and familiarity. Tired of people who couldn't see beyond surface shimmer. But what they didn't know, what none of them saw, was that the man who commissioned this necklace was already in the room. He hadn't entered loudly. He never did. But he had been watching everything, and soon they would know exactly who he was. The clink of silverware and the lull of a string quartet filled the gaps between laughter and gossip, but Amira's silence was louder than any insult. She stood by a marble column near the dessert table, her presence delicate yet unshaken. The crystal chandeliers above scattered flecks of gold across the floor, but none of it seemed to touch her. Still, she remained poised, neither retreating nor reacting. Across the room, Celeste continued her performance, now drawing more guests into her orbit. "Honestly, I feel bad," she said, lifting her champagne flute. "She's probably just a guest of one of the junior sponsors, maybe doing them a favor by showing up dressed like that." A few heads turned toward Amira, some curious, others judging. No one approached her, until one man did. He was tall, in a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that whispered wealth without screaming it. His cufflinks bore no logo, his shoes were polished but understated. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need introductions, because in every important room his name had already arrived before he had: Cale Devenhart. A name rarely spoken aloud but often whispered behind closed doors. Billionaire entrepreneur, silent investor in multiple Fortune 500 companies, patron of the arts, and most recently, Amira's husband. When he crossed the room, the atmosphere shifted. Celeste's laughter faltered mid-breath. Several guests stiffened, straightening their posture as if summoned by royalty. A waiter stepped aside quickly, nearly dropping his tray. Cale didn't look at them. He walked straight to Amira, and then, without a word, he took her hand and kissed it. Just once. Amira smiled, for real this time. "You're right on time." He turned then, slowly, his eyes scanning the room like a spotlight that found every crack in the foundation. And when his gaze landed on Celeste, he smiled, not warmly, not rudely, just enough to disarm. "Celeste?" he said, as if greeting a distant cousin at a funeral. She stammered, caught off guard. "Mr. Devenhart, what a surprise. I didn't know you were attending tonight." Cale nodded slightly. "I wasn't going to. But then I heard my wife was already here, and, well, I couldn't resist." The word wife echoed through the room like a dropped glass. Celeste's lips parted slightly. "Your wife?" He glanced back at Amira, his expression filled with something no one else in that ballroom could fake. Pride. "Yes. Wearing the necklace I had commissioned as a one-of-one. 5 years of design, 27 international gem hunts, and a waiting list of museums asking to display it. I'd say she wears it better than any exhibit ever could." The air turned to stone, and for the first time that night, Amira was seen. Not because of who walked in with her, but because the room finally understood who she was all along. The ballroom stood still. Even the musicians had subtly slowed their tempo, the elegant waltz now just soft background noise to the moment unfolding in the center of the room. Celeste's frozen smile twitched slightly at the corners, as if trying to recalculate everything she had just said, and to whom. Around her, the whispers began shifting again, but this time, they weren't directed at Amira's necklace. They were about her. People who had chuckled earlier now looked stunned, embarrassed even, as they realized they had mocked the wife of one of the most powerful men in the room. And worse, mocked something he had created for her, a symbol of devotion and craftsmanship far beyond their comprehension. Cale's presence alone could have silenced the room, but he didn't stop at that. He turned to a nearby table where several of the earlier mockers sat, including the jeweler who had once offered Celeste a private line of museum-quality pieces. "Do you still consult for Leclerc's auctions?" Cale asked him casually. The man cleared his throat. "Yes, of course. I've worked with them for years." Cale nodded. "Good. Then you'll know exactly what I mean when I say this necklace was appraised at just over 5 million, not for the gemstones, though each is rare, but for the artisan work. It's a collaboration with Alaric Dubois before he retired. Hand-forged, every detail is symbolic." A stunned silence followed. Even Celeste looked as though she'd been struck in the chest. Alaric Dubois was a name spoken with reverence in elite jewelry circles, a craftsman who had refused commissions from royalty. If Cale had managed to commission him before retirement, that meant this piece was more than luxury. It was history, art, legacy, one of a kind. 5 million? Celeste echoed faintly, her voice stripped of its usual edge. Amira gently rested her hand on Cale's arm. She hadn't asked for any of this. Not the confrontation, not the humiliation of others. She had only wanted to attend a gala in peace, with the necklace that meant the world to her. Cale caught her silent plea and softened. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," he said, looking around. "But I will say this. Before you mock something again, perhaps ask why it doesn't glitter the way you expect. Some things shine differently because they were never made to impress a crowd. They were made to matter." His words landed, not like an insult, but like a mirror. The crowd didn't know where to look. Many turned away, ashamed of their earlier laughter. A few guests tried to change the subject, others pretended not to have noticed anything. But the silence around Amira had shifted. Now, instead of ignoring her, people were trying to see her clearly, as if relearning a person they had misread from the start. And Amira? She stood quietly, still wearing the same necklace, the same dress, and the same gentle smile. But now, the entire ballroom saw her differently, because now they knew who she was, and more importantly, what she had always been worth. As the atmosphere slowly began to thaw, a new kind of energy filled the room, an awkward mixture of curiosity, respect, and subtle regret. Guests who had previously avoided Amira's gaze now tried to catch her eye. A few attempted light small talk as she passed, dropping overly friendly compliments or exaggerated admiration for her necklace, hoping to rewrite the memory of their earlier snubs. But Amira responded with the same grace she had shown all evening, calm, poised, and polite, without opening the door too wide. Celeste, meanwhile, stood off to the side with her entourage, unusually quiet. Her confidence had slipped beneath the weight of her own behavior, and she looked visibly smaller than she had an hour ago. She glanced toward Amira and Cale, now seated side by side at a table near the center of the room, her usual table, the one reserved for top-tier donors and VIPs. From across the ballroom, the event host, an older gentleman with silver hair and a reputation for knowing exactly who mattered in any given room, approached them with a respectful nod. "Mr. Devonhart, Mrs. Devonhart," he said, "thank you for gracing the evening. I must say your arrival has changed the tone of the entire night." Cale offered a modest smile, while Amira merely nodded. "We'd be honored," the host continued, "if you'd join us on stage to open the next segment of the charity auction. I believe your presence would inspire a few generous hearts." Cale looked at Amira, clearly. "Of course, it would be our pleasure." As they rose and walked toward the stage, the crowd instinctively parted, offering them space not just out of respect, but recognition. Not just because of Cale's influence, but because Amira had become the quiet center of the entire event. Not through volume, not through drama, but through patience, dignity, and truth. Up on the stage, Amira stood beside her husband as he offered a brief, elegant message about generosity and humility. And then, when it came time for the first item to be auctioned, a custom diamond brooch designed by a famous fashion house, Cale held up a single hand and placed a bid, double the starting value. The room gasped. Then he leaned toward the microphone, smiled slightly, and said, "But I'll only complete the purchase if my wife agrees to wear it." The crowd laughed, not mockingly, but genuinely, light-hearted, different. Amira took the mic gently. "Only if Celeste helps model it first," she said with a quiet, almost mischievous smile. For a moment, the room paused, unsure whether to laugh. Then Celeste, face flushed, forced a grin and gave a small nod. "Of course," she said, stepping forward with a grace that had turned noticeably humbler. It wasn't revenge, not quite. It was something far more powerful. It was a moment of poetic justice, elegant, unspoken, and unforgettable. The rest of the evening unfolded with a kind of reverence that hadn't existed before. The auction continued, but now with more generous bids, more sincere applause, and an unmistakable shift in tone. No one spoke over the host anymore. No one scoffed at subtle jewelry or whispered behind raised glasses. It was as if Amira's presence and the quiet storm of truth she had carried had rewired the room's sense of value. After the final item had been sold, the guests gathered once more for champagne and conversation. Only this time, Amira was not alone in the corner. She was the quiet heartbeat of every group, approached with cautious admiration. Some asked about her necklace. Others complimented her composure. A few offered apologies, veiled as compliments, and though she accepted each with grace, she remembered every word that had been spoken before the truth came out. Cale stayed close, not out of possessiveness, but pride. He never once tried to overshadow her. In fact, he seemed content to let her take center stage now. He knew she didn't need his protection. All she ever needed was space to be seen for who she really was. Near the end of the night, the host returned, this time with a small envelope. "Mrs. Devonhart," he said, "in honor of tonight's success and in appreciation for your enlightening presence, we'd like to offer you the title of honorary patron of the gala. It's never been given before, but we feel it's overdue." Amira blinked, stunned. Not because she needed the recognition, but because it was finally being offered on her terms, not based on her name, her wealth, or her connection to her husband, but because of how she carried herself in the face of cruelty. She accepted the envelope with a soft smile. "Thank you, that means more than you know." As the crowd slowly filtered out into the night, many glanced back at her one last time, not out of curiosity, but respect. A few guests removed their name tags discreetly, suddenly unsure whether their designer labels had ever really mattered. And Celeste? She left quietly, her head not held high this time, but bowed just enough to show she'd understood something important. Outside, the driver opened the car door for Amira and Cale. Before stepping in, she looked back at the ballroom, still lit, still echoing with music and chatter. "It's funny," she said softly to Cale, "how something so small can make people show their true size." Cale chuckled, helping her into the car. "It wasn't the necklace, Amira. It was you." And as the doors closed and the car pulled away, the necklace still shimmered against her skin, not from the chandeliers above, but from something deeper, the kind of light that never fades. Because in a world obsessed with glitter, Amira had reminded them all what it meant to shine.